My son put me in a nursing home while I was still recovering from surgery. I was in a wheelchair, 4 days out of a hip replacement, still foggy from the anesthesia and the painkillers, and my daughter-in-law stood in the doorway of that little room with a folder of papers and signed the last one with a flourish. And then she looked at me, and she smiled, and she said, "It's permanent, Leon. You should know that. And the house is ours now." The house. My house. The house I'd lived in for 41 years. The house I'd carried my wife Margaret over the threshold of and buried her out of just 4 months earlier. And I did not shout. I did not weep, though God knows there was reason to. I looked at my son's wife from that wheelchair, and I nodded, slowly, like a tired old man accepting his fate. And then I turned to the nurse who was standing there looking uncomfortable, a kind-faced woman named Denise, and I asked her very quietly for 2 things. I asked her if she could bring me 1 envelope and 1 stamp, that's all. 1 envelope, 1 stamp. And 5 weeks later, a black car pulled up and parked outside my son's front door. And my son called me on the telephone, and when I answered, his voice was breaking so badly he could barely get the words out. I need to stop right here 10 seconds in because I want to be honest with you about who I am, so you understand how a man in a wheelchair with a stolen house ends up being the calm one in this story. I am not a powerful man. I never was. I don't have money or lawyers on retainer or some secret fortune tucked away. I was a mailman. That's what I did for 40 years. I carried the mail, walked my route in the heat and the snow, put letters and bills and birthday cards into people's boxes 6 days a week for 4 decades. And that job, that humble, unglamorous job, taught me one thing that my son and his wife had completely forgotten about me, one thing that was worth more in that moment than all the money and lawyers in the world. It taught me exactly what a single letter, correctly addressed and properly mailed, can do. I spent my whole life knowing that 1 envelope, put into the system, will reach anyone, anywhere, and cannot be stopped. And they had left me with an envelope and a stamp because they thought a broken old man couldn't do anything with them. They were wrong. So if you've ever been discarded by the very people who were supposed to take care of you, thrown away at your lowest, weakest moment, by someone who mistook your weakness for the end of you, then stay with me and go ahead and subscribe, because this is a story about the quietest kind of power there is, and about how the people who forget to be afraid of a quiet man usually learn to be. Okay? Let me back up, because you can't understand that envelope until you understand how I ended up in that wheelchair, in that room, watching my daughter-in-law steal my home. My name is Leonard Boyd. Everyone calls me Leon. I'm 72 years old, and until 4 months before all this I had a good life, a small one, but a good one. I'd retired from the Postal Service after 40 years. I had my house, paid off, the little brick place where my wife and I raised our son, and I had Margaret. Margaret and I were married for 46 years. She was the light of the whole thing, the reason any of it was good. Margaret and I did everything in that house. She had a garden out back that she fussed over for 30 years, tomatoes and roses, and she'd hand me a warm tomato off the vine in August like it was a gift from God. We had a spot on the back step where we'd sit in the evenings after I got home from my route and just talk, or not talk, for 46 years of evenings. Every room in that house had her in it. When you've loved someone in a place that long, the place stops being a building and becomes a kind of body that holds all your memories, and to lose the place is to lose them a second time. That's what my son and his wife didn't understand, or didn't care about, that they weren't just stealing an asset. They were stealing the last place on earth that still had Margaret in it. And then Margaret got sick, fast, a stroke, and 4 months before my son put me in that home, I lost her. I want you to understand what that does to a man, because it matters to this story. Losing your wife of 46 years hollows you out. It takes the floor out from under your whole life. I was not myself in those months. I was grieving, and I was lonely in a way I'd never known. And I was, I'll admit it, not paying close attention to things the way I should have been. I was a wounded animal, and I did not see the other thing coming, because I was too busy just trying to breathe through the loss of her. And that, I've come to understand, is exactly when they moved. because there is a particular kind of person who watches for weakness, who waits for you to be down, and who strikes when you can't defend yourself. And that person, in my life, turned out to be my son's wife. Now, my son, Craig, and the woman he married, that's where this turns, and it's the part that still keeps me up some nights. Craig is my only child, and I loved him the way you love an only child. Completely. Maybe too completely. His mother and I gave him everything we could. But I'll be honest with you about my son, because there's no point in this story if I lie about him. Craig grew up soft, and then he grew up weak. And there's a difference between those two things. And he was both. He was never cruel, not on his own. But he was easily led, always looking for the shortcut, always a little resentful that life hadn't handed him more. And he was the kind of man who could be steered by a stronger person into doing things he'd never have thought of himself. All he needed was the wrong person to do the steering. And then he married Heather. I'll tell you the truth about Heather, and the truth is that I saw it in her from very early, and I said nothing, because Margaret asked me not to make waves. Heather was sharp and ambitious, and cold underneath a warm surface, and from the moment she came into our family I could see that she looked at Margaret and me not as family, but as an obstacle and an opportunity at the same time. She looked at our paid-off house the way a hawk looks at a field, and she had Craig completely. Not through love, I don't think, but through a kind of control, the way a strong current has a boat that's lost its engine. Whatever Heather wanted, Craig would eventually do, and Heather wanted my house. For years, it stayed under the surface. There were comments. Heather would talk about how the house was too much for Margaret and me, how we should think about downsizing, how it made more sense for the house to go to the family, meaning her, while we moved somewhere smaller. Margaret and I would just smile and change the subject, and we were fine, and we held our ground without ever having to fight, because we were healthy and clear-headed and it was our house, and there was nothing anyone could do. And then Margaret died. And I was hollowed out and grieving, and a few months later my hip, which had been bad for years, finally gave out completely, and I needed a full replacement, a major surgery, general anesthesia, a hospital stay, and weeks of recovery afterward. And I was going to need help during that recovery, because I lived alone now, and I couldn't manage stairs or cooking on my own for a while. And that was the opening they'd been waiting for. Here is how it happened, and I want to lay it out clearly, because the details are everything. The details are what put a black car outside my son's door 5 weeks later. When it came time for my surgery, Craig and Heather stepped in, all helpfulness. They said they'd handle everything. They said I shouldn't worry about a thing, just focus on getting better. And in my state, grieving, in pain, about to go under the knife, grateful for what looked like my son finally showing up for me, I let them. I signed a few things they put in front of me before the surgery, things they said were just to help manage things while I was recovering, and I didn't read them as carefully as I should have, because I was a foolish, trusting, broken old man who wanted to believe his son loved him. I think one of them was a power of attorney, a limited one, to handle my affairs during my recovery. I'm still not certain everything I signed, that's my own failure, and I've had to forgive myself for it, because grief makes fools of us all. I went in for the surgery. It went fine, medically. A full hip replacement under general anesthesia. I was completely unconscious, out cold for hours, and then groggy and monitored in the hospital for days after. And while I was literally unconscious on an operating table with a documented medical record of exactly where I was and what state I was in, Craig and Heather did the thing that they will spend the next several years of their lives regretting. They forged my signature on a deed, a quitclaim deed, transferring ownership of my house, my paid-off 41-year home, from me to the two of them. They dated it, and they got it notarized, and they recorded it with the county, making it look, on paper, like I had signed my house over to my son and his wife of my own free will. Except I hadn't. I couldn't have, because on the date they claimed I signed that deed, I was unconscious on an operating table having my hip replaced, and there is a hospital's worth of records, monitors, doctors, and nurses to prove it. You cannot sign a deed while you are under general anesthesia. It is one of the few alibis in this world that is completely and medically airtight. But they didn't think about that. They were greedy, and they were in a hurry, and they thought a grieving old man recovering from surgery would never fight it or never be able to. So they forged the one document that a corpse's worth of hospital records could disprove. I remember almost nothing of the surgery day itself, which is exactly the point. It's why they chose it. I remember Craig's face in the pre-op room, and I remember thinking, foggy with the pre-medication, that he looked strange, guilty almost. And I remember reaching for his hand and him not quite giving it, and then the mask, and then nothing. Hours of nothing. I was as absent from the world as a person can be while still breathing. And it was in exactly those hours, while I lay unconscious with the surgeon's hands inside my hip, that somewhere a pen was moving across a deed, writing my name in a hand that wasn't mine. I think about that sometimes. That, at the precise moment I was most helpless, most trusting, most unconscious of the world, the people who were supposed to be guarding me were robbing me. There's a particular horror to that timing that I've never fully shaken. After the surgery, instead of taking me home to recover, they took me to a nursing home. Now, some rehabilitation after a hip replacement is normal, even a short nursing home stay for physical therapy. So at first, it looked legitimate, and I was too foggy to question it. But then, the days stretched on, and I started to get my wits back, and I started to notice that something was very wrong. Nobody was talking about me going home. My questions were being brushed aside, and Craig had gone strange and distant and wouldn't quite look at me. And then came the day my daughter-in-law walked into my room with that folder and signed the last form and told me it was permanent, and that the house was theirs now, and smiled at me while she said it. There were nights in that place before Denise when I lay awake in the dark and genuinely wondered if this was how it ended, if I'd grieve my wife, lose my house, and then just fade out in a room that smelled of disinfectant, forgotten, with my own son as the one who put me there. That's the thing they count on, the people who do this. Not just the paperwork, the despair. They isolate you until you believe the story they're telling, that you're finished, that no one's coming, that fighting is pointless. And for a few nights I'll admit I nearly believed it. The lowest moment of my whole life wasn't the surgery or even losing Margaret. It was lying in that bed believing my own boy had thrown me away, and that there was nothing I could do. What pulled me out of it wasn't strength. It was clarity. And then it was one kind nurse, and then it was an envelope. I want to be careful here because there's a legal point that matters. What she said, that they could just make my stay permanent, and that they now owned my house, was not actually true in the way she thought. You cannot simply lock a competent adult in a nursing home forever against his will by signing a form. That's not how any of it works. And you certainly cannot take a man's house by declaring that it's yours. But Heather either didn't fully understand that, or she was counting on me not understanding it, on me being too old and broken and grief-stricken to fight, on the forged deed being enough to muddy the waters, and the isolation being enough to keep me quiet. She was building a wall around me out of confidence and paperwork, betting that a wounded old man wouldn't test it. But here's the thing that changed everything. The thing that happened. Inside me, in the moment, she said, "The house is ours now." Because up until that sentence I had been confused, foggy, half believing this was all some misunderstanding, some overcautious family decision. But when she said those words, and I saw the look on her face, that little smile of triumph, the fog burned off all at once, and I understood everything, completely and coldly. I understood that they had stolen my house. I understood that they must have forged something because I had never signed my house away. And I understood, with the strange calm that comes when you finally see a thing clearly, that they had made a terrible mistake. Because whatever they had forged it while I was in a hospital having surgery, and that meant it could be undone. And I understood one more thing. I understood that I was, at that moment, nearly powerless. I was in a wheelchair, weak, recovering, in a facility they had put me in with my access to the outside world limited to what they allowed. My phone, I later realized, had been lost in the shuffle of the hospital and the move, conveniently. I had no lawyer standing by, no family on my side, no way to just get up and walk out and drive to the county office and set things right. I was an old man alone in a room, and the people who should have protected me were the ones who'd put me there. But I was not as powerless as they thought, because I had spent 40 years in the postal service, and I knew something they had forgotten in their whole scheme. I knew that the one thing they could not control, the one channel out of that room that they could not intercept or lose, was the mail. A letter, placed into the United States mail, is protected by federal law, and it will go where it is addressed, and no daughter-in-law on earth can stop it. They had taken my house and my phone and my freedom. They had not taken my ability to write a letter and put a stamp on it, because it never occurred to them that a letter could be a weapon. So that's what I asked Denise, the nurse, for. 1 envelope and 1 stamp. I have to tell you about Denise because she's one of the 2 people who saved me, and because this story would have a very different ending without her. Denise was a nurse at that facility, a woman in her 50s who had seen a lot and missed very little. And Denise had been watching my situation with a growing unease, because she'd been doing this work long enough to know what it looks like when a family dumps an inconvenient elderly relative, and to know the difference between a man who belongs in permanent care and a man who's been put somewhere to get him out of the way. And she'd looked at me, clear-eyed, competent, grieving, but entirely sound of mind, and she'd known something was wrong. When I asked her for the envelope and the stamp, she brought them without a word, and she watched me for a moment while I sat there with the pen shaking a little in my hand, and then she said quietly, "Mr. Boyd, is everything all right with your situation here? Because if it isn't, there are people whose job it is to help, and I can help you reach them." And I looked at this kind stranger, the first person in months who had looked at me and seen a man worth protecting, and I nearly broke down, because I hadn't realized how alone I'd felt until someone offered not to leave me that way. And I told her the truth. All of it. That my house had been stolen, that I'd been put here against my will. And Denise's face went very still and very serious, and she told me 2 things. She told me that what I was describing had a name, elder abuse, and specifically the financial kind, and that it was a crime, a serious one, that the authorities took very seriously. And she told me that she was, by law and by conscience, going to help me report it, and that I was not going to face it alone. So that night, in that little room, I wrote the most important letter of my life. I wrote it by hand, on paper Denise brought me, and I addressed it to a man named Sol Pell. Sol Pell had been my lawyer for 30 years, not a fancy one, just a small-town attorney who'd handled my and Margaret's simple affairs, our wills, the paperwork when we paid off the house, the small legal business of an ordinary life. Sol knew me. Sol knew my signature. Sol had known Margaret. And Sol was exactly the kind of decent, dogged old country lawyer who would read a letter like mine and get out of his chair and do something about it. It's a strange thing, to write the most important letter of your life at 72 in a nursing home bed with a borrowed pen that won't quite hold ink and a hand still weak from surgery. I'd delivered millions of letters in my life. I'd carried people's whole lives in my bag, their good news and their bad news, their love letters and their eviction notices, the checks that saved them and the bills that sank them. And I'd always known, in an abstract way, how much a single envelope could carry. But I'd never needed one myself, not like this, not to save my own life. And I found, sitting there, that all those years on the route had taught me exactly how to do it. Keep it clear, keep it simple, put the most important fact where it can't be missed, and address it to the one person who will actually act. A good letter is like a good delivery. It gets the right thing to the right person, and then it's out of your hands. In that letter, I laid it all out, plainly, the way 40 years of reading other people's mail teaches you to be plain. I told Sol that my son and his wife had committed me to a care facility against my will while I recovered from hip surgery. I told him that my daughter-in-law had informed me they now owned my house. I told him I had never signed my home over to a living soul, and that if a deed existed bearing my signature, that signature was forged. And then I told him the thing that I knew would make him move. I told him the date they would have needed me to sign it, right around my surgery, and I told him that on that date, I was under general anesthesia at the hospital, unconscious, having my hip replaced, and that the hospital had the records to prove exactly where I was. I asked him to pull the deed from the county, check its date against my hospital records, and do whatever a man does to take back a house that's been stolen from him. And I signed it in my own real hand, and I put it in the envelope, and Denise put the stamp on it. And Denise, not me, because I couldn't get to a mailbox, Denise carried that letter out of the building and dropped it in the mail herself, so that it could not be lost or found or intercepted. And then I waited. And here is where I have to tell you what that letter set in motion, because it moved faster and went further than even I expected. Sewell Pell got my letter 2 days later, and Sewell, God bless him, did exactly what I knew he'd do. He was, by his own account later, first heartbroken and then furious. Heartbroken because he'd known Margaret and me for 30 years and couldn't believe what he was reading, and furious because there are few things that make an honest old lawyer angrier than someone preying on a grieving widower. He drove to the county recorder's office that same day and pulled the deed, and there it was. A quit-claim deed transferring my house to Craig and Heather, bearing a signature that was supposed to be mine, dated and notarized right in the window of my surgery. Then Sewell did the simple, devastating thing. He requested my hospital records for that date. And the records showed, in unarguable medical black and white, that at the time I supposedly sat down and signed and notarized a deed, I was in an operating room, under general anesthesia, being operated on. I could no more have signed that deed than I could have flown. The forgery wasn't just probable. It was proven, absolutely, by the kind of evidence no lawyer can argue around. And that turned everything from a family dispute into a crime. Because forging a deed is not a misunderstanding. It's forgery, a felony. Recording a forged deed with the county is another crime. And doing all of it to steal the home of an elderly parent while he recovers from surgery, that's elder financial abuse, which prosecutors and the law take with deadly seriousness, because our society has decided rightly that preying on the vulnerable old is one of the lowest things a person can do. Sewell didn't just file to void the deed, though he did that too. Sewell took the whole thing, the forged deed, the hospital records, my letter, to the district attorney's office and to Adult Protective Services. And once professionals looked at it, it moved out of my hands and into the machinery of the law, which is exactly where it belonged, and exactly where Heather's confidence and Craig's weakness had no power at all. Denise, on her end, had already filed her own report as a mandated reporter, so by the time it all converged, there were multiple channels all pointing at the same thing: a forged deed, an airtight alibi, a vulnerable elder, and 2 people who had committed a serious crime. The wheels of that kind of thing turn quietly, and then all at once. For a few weeks from my room, I knew almost nothing except what Sewell told me in careful phone calls once he'd gotten me a phone I could actually use. He got me out of that nursing home, first of all. That was easy once the authorities understood I was a competent adult being held against my will. I was a free man within days of the investigation starting, though I stayed with an old friend rather than go back to a house that was still, on paper, in dispute. And Sewell told me to be patient, that these things had to be done right, and that when it was ready, it would happen all at once. And 5 weeks after I mailed that letter, it happened all at once. On a Tuesday afternoon, a black car, an unmarked police car, it turned out, carrying a detective from the department's financial crimes unit and a second vehicle behind it, rolled to a stop outside my son and daughter-in-law's house. My house, legally speaking, though they'd been living in it as if it were theirs. And the detective went to the door with an arrest warrant, because by then the district attorney had reviewed the evidence: the forged deed, the notarization, the recorded document, and the hospital records that made it all impossible, and had decided there was more than enough to charge both Craig and Heather with forgery and elder financial abuse. And that's when my phone rang, and it was Craig, and his voice was breaking. I want to tell you about that phone call because it's the heart of this whole thing, and because it did not go the way these stories usually go, and I won't pretend it did. Craig was sobbing. He could barely form the words. There was a detective at his door, he said. There were police. He said, "Dad, they're saying we forged. They're saying it's a crime. Dad, please. You have to tell them. You have to make it stop. They're going to arrest us." And underneath the panic I could hear the other thing, the thing I'd waited to hear and dreaded hearing in the same breath. I could hear that he knew. He knew exactly what he'd done. This wasn't a man protesting his innocence. This was a man who had done a terrible thing to his own father, gambled that his father was too weak and too grief-stricken to stop him, and had just discovered, with a black car outside his door, that he'd lost that gamble completely. And I sat there with the phone against my ear, listening to my only child cry, and I felt something I hadn't expected. I did not feel triumph. People imagine, in a moment like that you feel vindicated, victorious, that you savor it. I didn't. What I felt, listening to my son beg me to save him from the consequences of what he'd done to me, was the deepest grief I'd felt since Margaret died. Because I was, in that moment, finally and completely losing the last illusion I had left. The illusion that my son loved me, that whatever his weaknesses, there was a line he wouldn't cross. He had crossed it. He had forged my name to steal my home while I lay unconscious on a table, 4 months after I buried his mother. And no phone call, no tears, could put that back. So I'll tell you what I said to my son, and I've made my peace with it, though it was the hardest thing I've ever said. I said, "Craig, I'm not going to tell them to stop. I can't. What you did is not something I can make go away, and it's not something I should. You forged my name, you stole my house while I was in surgery, you put me in a home and swore to me it was for good. I didn't do this to you, son. You did this to yourself and to me, and now it has to run its course." And he was crying, saying he was sorry, saying Heather had pushed him, saying he never wanted this, and I believed that last part. I did. I believed he'd been steered into it by a stronger, colder person. But I told him the truth that a father sometimes has to tell a grown son, which is this: being led into a terrible thing doesn't make you innocent of it. You're a grown man. You had a choice every single step of the way, and every step you chose her scheme over your own father. I'll always love you, Craig, but I won't lie for you, and I won't save you from this, because the most loving thing I can do now is let you finally face the truth of what you're capable of. And I hung up, and I sat in my friend's kitchen, and I wept for a long time, not for the house but for the son I'd thought I had. Here is how it all resolved. Because you deserve the ending, and because the ending is more complicated than a simple triumph, and I promised you the truth. The forged deed was voided completely. That part was straightforward once the forgery was proven. A deed you didn't sign is legally worthless, and the court restored the house to my name, cleanly, where it had always truly belonged. I got my home back. The little brick house where I'd carried Margaret over the threshold, where we'd raised Craig, where 41 years of my life had happened, was mine again, and no one could take it, because the truth had proven itself the way the truth eventually does. Heather was prosecuted. She was the architect of the whole thing, and the evidence was overwhelming, and she faced the full weight of it. Forgery and elder financial abuse are serious felonies, and she was not a sympathetic defendant, a woman who'd forged a grieving widower's signature to steal his house while he was unconscious in surgery. I won't detail her sentence except to say that she faced real consequences, the kind that change a life, and that Craig's marriage to her did not survive it, which surprised no one. Craig is the part I can't tie up in a bow, and I won't try to. My son also faced charges because he was a full participant, not a bystander, and the law does not excuse a man for being led. What happened to him legally was more merciful than what happened to Heather. His cooperation, his genuine remorse, and my own decision not to push for the harshest possible outcome for my own child all factored in, but he did not walk away clean, and he shouldn't have. He faced consequences too, and more than the legal consequences, he has to live now with what he did, with being a man who forged his own father's name, and I don't think that's a thing you ever fully put down. People ask me if I've forgiven Craig, and it's the hardest question anyone asks me, and I'll give you the honest, complicated answer. I have not cut my son out of my life completely. He's my only child, and Margaret would not have wanted me to lose him entirely, and there's a grandchild in the picture whom I love. So there's contact. Careful, limited, changed contact. But I will tell you that the relationship we had is gone, and it's not coming back, and I've stopped pretending it might. The father who trusted his son completely, and the son who could be trusted, those two people don't exist anymore. What's left is quieter and sadder and more honest. A father and a son who both know exactly what the son was capable of, trying to figure out what, if anything, can be built on top of that ruin. Some betrayals you forgive but don't forget. Some you don't even fully forgive. You just carry them, and you don't let them turn you into a bitter man, because bitterness would be letting them take something else from you, and they'd taken enough. Now, let me tell you about the good that came out of it. Because there was some, and it came from the direction I least expected. Denise, the nurse, she and I are friends now, real friends. She checked on me all through the case, and after, and she introduced me to some people, and she pulled me back into the world at a time when I'd have been happy to disappear into that empty house and just wait to join Margaret. She wouldn't let me. And through her, and through Saul Pell, who's become more friend than lawyer, and through an old friend or two I'd let drift, I found something I hadn't expected to find at 72, which was a life again. A small one, but a real one. I volunteer now. I help other seniors, actually. Folks in situations like mine were, because it turns out there are a lot of us. A lot of old people being preyed upon by the very people who should love them. And it turns out an old mailman who beat it with one envelope has something useful to offer them. It gave me a purpose I didn't have before. Margaret would have liked that. She always said I was happiest when I had a route to walk and people to look after. Let me leave you with one thing, and then a question, because I really do read these. They thought I was finished. That's the whole thing right there. They looked at a grieving, broken, wheelchair-bound old man, and they saw someone who was done, powerless, easy, at the end of his usefulness and his fight. And they were so sure of it that they got careless, and they left a finished old man alone with an envelope and a stamp. But no one is ever as finished as the people who want to discard you need you to be. The quietest, weakest-looking person in the room is very often holding more than you think. A truth, a witness, a single letter that can bring the whole thing down. They stole my house with a forged signature. I took it back with a real one, on a letter, dropped in the mail by a kind stranger, protected by the same postal system I'd served for 40 years. Sometimes justice doesn't come from power. Sometimes it comes from an envelope and a stamp and the simple, unstoppable fact of the truth. So here's my question, and I'd genuinely like to know. Have you ever been written off as finished by someone who underestimated you at your lowest, and found, when it counted, that you had more strength or more truth on your side than they ever imagined? Tell me about it. I read every single one. And if this story meant something to you, do me one small kindness before you go. Leave a comment, even a single word, so I know you stayed with me all the way to the end. And subscribe so the next story finds you when it comes. Because they keep coming. And if you take one thing from an old mailman, take this. Never underestimate the quiet ones. And never, ever throw away someone while they can still reach a mailbox. The most dangerous person in the world is the one you've decided is already beaten.